I got a question for you. Do you cut and stack a roof or a roof? Is that a meaningless question? Well, I don't think so if you read the comments, because a lot of you seem to think I pronounce roof wrong. Look it up, my friends. I did the other day. And it can be pronounced either way. Roof, man, that's weird, or roof, feels normal. But be that as it may, I had a chance to sit down a few weeks ago with Barry Mussel. Barry Mussel wrote the Roof Framer's Bible. I wish I would have had this in my pocket when I was cutting a few roofs in Las Vegas, because it's magic, it's a reference like none other. But what I really enjoyed about talking with Barry was the fact that he has spent 50 years cutting roofs, supervising roof cutters, supervising framing generally, big time scale. 5 states, 70 crews, 1,000 houses a year. He had bottom line responsibility for the practice, the process, and the quality. I learned a lot talking to this guy. And if you're coming up to a spot in your life where you need to either A, build a roof, maybe you want to be a roof cutter, maybe you've hired a house to be built, or I don't know, maybe you're showing up on a job and you want to have some idea about what you might have to do if they ask you to cut a rafter, I think you're going to enjoy our conversation. And I know that when you get to the end of it, you're going to have a new appreciation for the difference between a roofer and a roof cutter. In my conversation with Barry, we start out sort of at ground level. What's a rafter? What's a hip? What's a valley? How do you cut them? What's a bastard hip? What do offset pitches do to how the cornice aligns when you're hanging the fascia? How do you even deal with that? How do you think about it? Right up through, what is the first thing a guy needs to think about if he's taken a job and he's going to be the roof cutter? What's the first thing you check when you walk onto the slab or the floor and you start deciding whether or not the dimensions that you have calculated, or maybe that you've pulled out of Barry's book, the Roof Framer's Bible, are even going to work? And whether or not the guys that put those walls up and plumb and lined them did you any favors, or whether they set a giant bear trap that you're just about to put your foot into. I hope you find the conversation worthwhile and stimulating. For me, it was enlightening and helped me remember some stories from the good old days that in some cases I think I was better off not remembering. Barry, it's still good to have you here, man. I've been loving this conversation. I want to talk on behalf of the people who may be watching this who are not familiar with the terms which in construction parlance are just everyday terms. Mm-hmm. But if they don't know that language, they're going to find themselves in situations where they're embarrassed, or maybe they're taken advantage of because they don't know. Mm-hmm. So when somebody talks about the pitch of the roof, the slope of the roof, it's 312, 1212, 812, 617, all of these numbers are bandied about. Mm-hmm. Help us understand what the pitch of a roof is.
Well, both of them indicate the degree of slope or inclination of the rafters on the roof. Mm-hmm. Now, the old-timers were very adamant that pitch, with a quarter pitch,
Quarter pitch, full pitch, half pitch.
312 is a quarter pitch. So there's debates about that and people's preference of use of one term or the other. In the Southeast, we all refer to pitch as whatever number over 12.
So let me tell you this, in the Southwest and in the Northwest, we do the same thing. So I don't know where they use, full pitch, half pitch, quarter pitch, but anyway, go ahead.
So a 412 pitch will rise 4 feet in a 12-foot run. Mm-hmm. So for every horizontally 12 feet, it will rise 4 feet. And that denotes or quantifies the slope or pitch of the roof.
Mm-hmm. And here's a note for you. If somebody's talking about a 412 pitch roof, you're probably going to be able to get up there and sweep it off if you want. And you can even lay your broom on the roof and it won't slide. But as it starts getting up steeper than that, you got to pay attention, right?
Yeah. 912 and above, you better wear your sneakers.
That's right. You might even have a rope around your waist.
You better.
Yeah. All right, so that's good. It's a slope most often expressed with 2 numbers. Mm-hmm. The rise over the run, mm-hmm. and the run is almost always on a common rafter 12.
Correct.
Okay, all right. Rafter. What is a rafter? There are different kinds of rafters. Talk to us about rafters.
Rafters are basically the members that form the roof surface. And as you say, there's different kinds. There's common rafters, jack rafters, hip rafters, valley rafters, a lot of different kinds of rafters. And you have, broken hips and, hip jacks and valley jacks. There's all different kinds. But rafters themselves are just the structural members that form the sloping portions of the roof.
Okay. And they come in different sizes because they have different spans and they have different amounts of strength. But if somebody's talking to you about the rafters, they're talking about the boards that make that sloping surface, almost always sloping, that create the structure of the roof. Easy peasy, right? All right, a gable. Talk to us about a gable.
Well, you just want to think of Snoopy's doghouse. It's a simple gable roof. 2 common rafters sloping up to a ridge. Nice and simple. Just think a little simple doghouse. That's a gable roof.
A gable roof. And gable roofs terminate in gable ends. Somebody talks about the gable end and how you're going to treat the siding on your gable end. They're talking about that peaked shape, triangular shape on the end of Snoopy's doghouse where the common rafters come to the end of the building and usually overhang a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Now, an argument or a disagreement that crops up around here from time to time is those rafters out on the edge, they're on the overhang. In the southeast, you guys call those barge rafters or varge rafters. What do you call those down there?
Most of the time we call them a barge rafter. Some people call them a fly rafter.
Fly rafter, yep, all right. So there's more definitions, right? Don't be confused. A hip. A hip is different than a gable. How?
It is. A hip is like a pyramid. So instead of just 2 slopes with a flat gable end, a hip is sloped on all sides. So it's sloped all the way around. And a regular hip would have the exact same pitch all the way around. So just think a pyramid.
A pyramid, all right. And it can be steeper or shallower, but they all have to have straight hips. There's nothing that bugs me worse than driving by a house and that hip's got just any kind of a dog leg in it.
Yeah.
And that's not all that easy to make straight, is it?
Well,
If you don't know how.
it's easier to do it right than it is to do it wrong. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. So in Vegas, that tract I worked on, Crystal Bay, where I stacked 164 houses in a year in one tract. They had step trusses for those hips. And so you had those little intermediate blocks in between the transitions and those step trusses. That was a struggle.
I self-selected myself out of trusses because, particularly hip trusses, because the trusses are not uniform.
Yeah.
You cannot massage those things to get the roof lines as straight as I like them to be.
Yeah.
And particularly, those hip lines.
Those hip lines.
I hate them.
Step trusses, yeah, they were rough. All right, now we've talked about hips, a pyramid in shape. Talk to us about valleys.
A valley is pretty simple. You've got just like a mountain valley. You've got 2 slopes, and to be clear, roofs can have all kind of combinations. They're not just hip or just gable.
But there's a hip roof with a straight gable sticking out of the side. So this becomes a gable end, and this is a hip line, and that's the ridge. You can study that. And if you're interested, let's just pitch your book a little bit, okay? Barry wrote a book. Now, not many people write books, especially as useful as this one. And all of these items and all of these definitions and everything that you're going to need to know about doing this kind of work or checking on the work that someone else is doing on your behalf, you can find in here. But let's press forward just a little bit. The valley.
The valley is where these 2 surfaces come together to form a valley, just the low point of the roof.
I had never associated it with valleys and mountains because every valley and every mountain range carries water, right? You have these slopes coming together. And when it's flood season, it carries a lot of water. And so the valley, the challenge with valleys for roofers is to make sure they're watertight, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The challenge for a framer is to make sure they're strong enough.
Okay. Great point. Yeah, that's right. And straight enough.
Right.
So if they're using metal in the valley, you don't have to fight that. All right. So we're going to show these people a picture of the roof that your brother did out of concrete in Hawaii. It's staggering because it's combining. And you had to clean up the design in that roof, didn't you?
Yeah, and that's a more extended conversation, but the detailing of how they wanted to connect the structural diaphragms when it's concrete house. Bear in mind, it's built in a seismic zone, hurricane zone. So the engineer was rightly focused on some of these structural details, but to the exclusion of common sense.
Yeah.
And so what he designed was just not constructible. It would have been hideously labor intensive, and frankly, I don't think in the end it would have structurally delivered either. I mean, because in theory, you had the connections but you'd had to execute perfectly. The concrete would have to be consolidated absolutely perfectly. The welds absolutely perfect. It's a long story about that, but yeah, a very, very complicated thing. A completely concrete house.
Completely concrete. All the hips, all the valleys, all the gables, everything. And that was a fairly low slope. That was like a 412, 312. Yeah, yeah. All right, well, that was a small blessing for those guys. All right, so just to kind of wrap this up, I've got some other questions for you. What are some of the biggest challenges for a young carpenter when he's got to cut a roof? Just give me 2 or 3 challenges that a young carpenter has to face when he's cutting a roof.
Well, obviously, I mean, you have to put the legwork to understand it well enough to execute your trade. And if you got a very complicated roof, that can be a significant challenge.
Yeah.
But beyond that is the plate lines have to be proper dimension and they have to be level.
And straight.
And straight.
Yeah.
So now, in our world in the Southeast, we didn't do it California style, where one guy, popped the lines on the slab, another guy built the walls, another guy did this, another guy did that. So, yes, I never worked in that world. I can only imagine the challenges for somebody cutting a roof on top of a house somebody else built.
That's right.
But in the Southeast, we did the whole thing. We started from the foundation and we took it all the way to tar paper on the roof.
Yeah.
So if there was a problem, we owned it. We did it. We owned it.
Had to fix it.
But for stacking that roof, and that's a California term or a Western term, I guess. Anyway, stacking. You don't really hear people in the Southeast refer to it as stacking a roof, but I guess that's because they were piecework. The pieces were already cut. They were just stacking it up there. In our world, we just gonna frame a roof.
Yeah.
But the plate lines have to be straight. They have to be the right dimension. If the house is bigger on one end than the other, and you're using the same common rafters, your ridge is out of level.
Yeah.
The structure you're putting the rafters on has to be uniform. And if it's out of level or in a twist, your hips are not going to work. This one's too long, that one's too short.
And then you're fudging and you're shimming and you're shaving and your stand is different on your hip and it's chaos. So if you're having a house built and it's time for the roof to go on, you might get in there after the walls are up and plumb and lined. Your wall framers have to have plumb and lined those walls, and just check some dimensions and ask the general or the framing foreman, are these dimensions uniform? I want you to write down what they are, because if they're not, there's going to be a problem. All right. So give us just one quick story on the outro of this right now. Can you think of the most expensive framing mistake that you ever had to deal with?
Yeah, and this was a design problem.
Okay.
We had this, I was working for a different company, but they were doing these in volume. And they discovered, the density environments, whatever, tended, the market dynamic and everything for economy to go to townhomes. It's just an affordability problem.
Yes.
So they went townhomes. But after they built a lot of townhomes, particularly in certain markets, they had a real problem. It was a lawyer problem. They would have lawyers come in and buy one of your townhomes in say, an 800-unit townhome development. And they would proceed to tear it apart. Everything about it, completely dismantle it, and discover any kind of flaw they could find anywhere in there. Oh, my,
and do a class action.
Class action.
Oh, my.
So they could, in one suit, they could get claims or settlement recovery on 900 units.
Oh.
So the company was doing them. They said, "Man, this is killer. We can't do townhomes." So they came up with, "We know what we'll do. They called it. I'm gonna use that term. That would tell what company it was. They said, "We're gonna make them single family, but we're gonna separate them by 3 feet." So they would have these 3- and 4-story structures with only 3 feet between them.
Staging that's a nightmare.
So they have the firewalls, required firewalls between them, but they were fee simple single-family homes. So when a lawyer was going to sue them, they had to sue one at a time.
Wow.
And so their liability for that dropped by tenfold.
Yeah.
So they said, they got excited about doing this. But the problem was,
Keep going.
They weren't properly engineered for that. So you've got these relatively skinny, tall structures that are not connected. A townhome is a different animal. You know,
Sure.
you get 8 units in one building. And so they needed steel moment frames. You know, because most of these are tall, skinny, and they got a 16-0 garage door in the first floor, where
Yeah.
your shear
Got nothing in
loads
that diaphragm.
are greatest in the bottom. You got this crazy lever of the wind acting on this. The moment arm is insane, and you got a 16-0 garage door hole in it.
Yeah.
And so they weren't properly designing, and it got a big argument with me about it. So in Atlanta, we had it out, and we said, okay, we're not doing that. You know, this is not right. So we put steel moment frames on them. Other cities, they did not. They had found an engineer that would
They would sign it off.
number whip the thing and say it was okay. Well, fast forward, they repurchased, the last count I heard, over $10 million of them.
Ouch. Ouch. So keeping in mind that we're talking to people who are interested in a roof right now, either to build it or to buy it, what was the most consistent mistake, the mistake that you saw most often that caused heartache, or aesthetically or structurally, or whatever type of, what mistake showed up most often in a roof?
Okay, 2 different scenarios, stick-built roof and a truss roof.
Okay.
Now, in a stick-built roof, it was just general straightness problems. They, you know, for whatever reason, if the walls were out of dimension, or they just cut things wrong, or they just not having
Sure.
due diligence. It was twisted, as you've already mentioned. The hips had a big curve in them. Certainly, when you get into the bastard hips that were regular pitch roofs, the cornice didn't align.
Okay, there's a big one. Let's give a definition. A bastard hip has nothing to do with its ancestry. It is where there's 2 different pitches. It's pitch A on this side and pitch B on this side, and now you're bringing 2 roof lines together that in their fundamental nature don't match. It's a problem, and it's why a resource like this book can save you. Let me just tell you, I always struggled with bastard hips. What can you tell us about that?
I don't know if that actually not.
Okay, yeah. You see how that illustrates how you have to make an 8-12 pitch come together with a, what's the other pitch on that one?
12-12.
A 12-12 and an 8-12? You have different elevations of the cornice or the fascia board or what happens in the overhang. And it's a real problem that a carpenter like me would spend days fighting with, and a carpenter like you could blow through in a reasonable amount of time.
So for the stick-built rule, the stick-built roofs, those are you know, cornice not aligning, big problem. On the truss side, again, because the irregularity of trusses in part, and partly because of the way they're set, you've got them crooked. You've already mentioned the hip lines.
All right, let me just make sure you know that we're talking about the difference between trusses and stick-built. A truss is that triangular shaped piece that comes and is set up with a crane usually, and it's stood up and presto. And a stick-built means you take a pile of boards and you cut them into the shape. Cut and stack is what I've been calling it. And so you have 2 different broad general types of
Right.
problems. And the
Right.
trusses tend to be defects in the manufacture more than the placement.
They, in more modern times, the truss tables are automated now. It's all computer oriented, and they've gotten better. But when you had to reset the jig all the time, they were inconsistent. So you get trusses from truss to truss. They just were irregular. They weren't
Irregular.
the same, and it made it a real challenge to try to give straight roof lines.
Okay.
But either then or now, with the more modern truss setups, the biggest continuing problem is incorrect truss bracing. Particularly
Once the
in a hip
trusses are
roof.
up, catwalks and the yeah.
Yeah, people do not understand trusses. They cannot read. 90% of people cannot read a truss drawing correctly. And
Let's make sure that people understand that. Your truss drawing is not just the representation of where the trusses go. It has to include a clear instruction on where the bracing goes. The catwalks along the bottom cords, if there's other bracing on webs, that's what we're talking about, right? The bracing at the ends of the gable ends. Do you guys run those from the outside wall up to the peak, or from the peak down to a catwalk on the inside?
well, that's a loaded question. It all depends on the structural requirements of that particular drawing. You have to follow the truss drawings.
Yeah.
And the cord bracing that we normally think of are only on compression cords.
Okay.
So when you have a truss, some members are in tension,
Yes.
being pulled straight apart. Other members are being compressed, like a stud in a wall.
Yes.
What happens if you overload a stud in the wall? It bows.
It buckles, yeah.
And the same thing with the components of a truss. So the compression cords of the truss are the ones that have to have those braces running along to prevent them from bowing side to side. And they're almost never they're almost never done correctly. If you had a relatively complicated hip roof structure and trusses are a lot of difference and everything, they almost never get them braced correctly. It takes some real diligence to go through and
To
do
get
it
them
correctly.
braced correctly. All right, so that's the takeaway on this, that I want you to understand that you better pay attention when they're putting the roof on your house, and you better pay attention if you're putting the roof on their house. Don't minimize the fine print on the truss instructions. Make sure that if the trusses come individually represented, that you have the right truss in the right place. Pay attention to your bracing, and if you don't buy this book, I recommend that you do, you better have something to get yourself out of the woods when you get into a roof that is really tricky. Thanks for watching Essential Craftsman, and keep up the good work.